Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to our virtual Lit Live series event here at Village Books in Bellingham, Washington. We are so delighted that you could make it this evening. My name is Claire. I'm the event coordinator for Village Books. And a few things about Crowdcast. If you've never watched a Crowdcast event before, if in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see that there's a follow button. It's green. If you click on the follow button, you can see all the events that we have on our Crowdcast channel. We have a whole lot of events coming down the road, and so I encourage you to click on that button so you can see what we have coming. We are not letting a pandemic slow down our robust event programming that we're known for at Village Books, so please feel free to check that out. If you happen to be hearing an echo, please try putting on some headphones or turning down the volume of your computer, or making sure that you only have one window open. If you have more than one window open in Crowdcast, you're going to get a terrible feedback and echo. So let's see, what else? We are going to disable the chat. I see that we have some folks who have already chimed in this evening, and we are delighted to hear from you. We're going to disable that feature just until the Q&A portion of the evening. We will bring you back so that you will be able to say, hooray, well done, make some comments, ask some more questions. An event that's coming up I want to let everyone know about here in Bellingham. Actually, it's a virtual event, so you can watch it from anywhere. On Friday night at 7 p.m., that's Pacific Standard Time, we're going to be welcoming Brian L. Griffin. He is a local historian in Bellingham who has written, this is his 5th book of local history on Bellingham, and he's going to be here at 7 o'clock on Friday, so that we hope you'll join us for that one. Another important feature of Crowdcast is this green button right here. It says purchase up against the wall here. If you click on that green button, it takes you directly to our Village Books website. If you're watching this event recorded on YouTube, if you look down in the description below us, you'll see that there's a link directly to our website where you can purchase Up Against the Wall. So we encourage you, if you would like to support the author and an independent bookstore, we encourage you to do so, and we thank you. All right, let's see. I think that's it for my housekeeping. So now, a little bit about our moderator this evening. We are delighted to welcome Peter B. Collins. He is a veteran radio host based in the San Francisco Bay Area. He's been talking about news and politics since Nixon was president, in Chicago, San Francisco, on satellite radio, and in national syndication. He now hosts a daily podcast at peterbcollins.com. And our featured author this evening is no stranger to the Village Books Readings Gallery. We are delighted to bring him back again. Peter Laufer, PhD, holds the inaugural James Wallace Chair in Journalism at the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication, where he was awarded the Marshall Prize for Teaching Innovation. A former and longtime global correspondent for NBC News, Laufer reports on borders, identities, and migration. He has covered the requisite wars and earthquakes, coups, and elections. And we are delighted because he's here tonight to discuss his brand new book, Up Against the Wall, The Case for Opening the Mexican-American Border. So please join me in the comfort of wherever you might be in giving a warm welcome to the two Peters, Peter B. Collins and Peter Laufer.
Claire, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you and to be the facilitator for a discussion with Peter Laufer on this program today. And whether you're watching live or you pick this up later in a podcast or on C-SPAN, we're delighted to have you join us. And Peter Laufer, for many years, has presented strong arguments for opening the southern border, for reducing the level of restriction on people who wish to travel, particularly from Mexico, into the United States. And in a way that is not argumentative, but I find highly persuasive. In his new book, Up Against the Wall, he makes a strong case. And along the way, using his incredible descriptive powers, and I really think that he is second to none in being able to, in a concise way, describe a scene, a room, a group of people, He carries you along through his own travels along the southern border and borders around the world. And along the way, I believe he makes a strong case for his ideas of how we should deal with our borders. Peter, this is not the first book that you've written, and in a moment we will enumerate some of the other books that you've written, and you've written many articles, you've done radio programs, both short form news and long form talk shows about these issues. You're quite literate on these matters. And let me begin by talking about some of the current issues related to immigration. For example, just a week or two ago, a nurse who turned whistleblower at an ICE detention center in Georgia went public with charges that a medical doctor there had performed hysterectomies on migrant women who were in custody, often without their consent or at least their full consent and knowledge. And this is just the latest example of our inhumane treatment of immigrants who we now place in detention under draconian policies of the Trump administration. What was your reaction when you heard this revelation? And how does it tie together with the pattern of family separation, kids in cages, the violation of the asylum laws of the United States to prevent individuals who have a credible claim from crossing our borders?
Well, yes, Peter, it's that litany that you just offered, and I'll address it in just a second. I want to thank Village Books for, again, welcoming me. It is always such a treat to come to Bellingham, and it's intriguing to come to Bellingham even without coming to Bellingham, as we are right now. And thank you, Peter. We've worked together a lot, and it's really valuable to have this conversation with you. The thing about these most recent revelations, and they really are revelations because this is the public sphere at work, and we should not need to know what's going on in our name and with our dollars because of a brave whistleblower. Every time one of these pieces of information about what goes on behind these closed doors, and they are closed doors almost always, even when reporters get in, the rules are oppressive regarding recording and cameras and note-taking and access. Every time one of these revelations comes out, the cages for the children, the violation, as you point out, of the asylum laws. Those seeking asylum are supposed to get into this country, so they're safe while their cases are being adjudicated. And now this horror of the surgery being performed, every time we think it can't possibly be more abusive, and to use your word, draconian, then we get another one. And this is the pattern of the Trump administration. Unfortunately, although it's happening in rapid succession and at extreme levels, it's also, to a great extent, the pattern of the United States government vis-a-vis immigration into this country historically.
And Peter, in terms of the asylum process, before COVID, we saw Jeff Sessions, when he was the Attorney General, redefine the terms of asylum to exclude domestic violence and criminal activity in the native lands, the native countries of individuals seeking asylum. Then we saw COVID used to essentially shut the process down after they came up with this convoluted scheme where an individual from El Salvador would have to go to Guatemala and request asylum there, be rejected, and then they could approach the U.S. Via Mexico. And the idea that someone who is at risk in El Salvador would be safe in Guatemala, or even in many cases in Mexico, is not borne out by any facts. It's in fact absurd. And so we've seen this twisting of the law, heavy pressure applied to these impoverished nations where Trump threatened to cut off the meager aid that we give them already, which would only exacerbate the problem. So these are not rational responses to what are serious issues.
Well, that's one of the things that I address in the book directly. I look for consensus. How can we work together when there is a problem? And pretty much all of us, no matter our points of view, can agree that the border is out of control. The border is chaos. The border is problematic. Migration issues are out of control. So I believe that once we have that predicate, that we agree that there's a problem, we can work together in some ways to find solutions. We can't do that when the goal of the administration is to demonize certain categories of migrants. And we can't do that when the administration is using all the tools at hand and the tools being the executive branch of the federal government, to study every possible way to make it difficult, if not impossible, for the type of migrants that they, the administration, clearly do not want here, because that's been articulated. Every possible avenue, every possible tool, every possible device to stop them. And these are enumerated in the book. It's what I'm looking at, both in terms of solutions and in terms of why the problem is as great as it is right now. The book looks at borders and walls across time, across cultures. But as you point out, Peter, it is focused on our border with Mexico, and my attempts to offer some ideas to deal with this chaotic reality are focused on Mexicans coming into the United States because of our special relationship, our special history with Mexico, and because of the adjacency of the two countries. We are twins. There's no getting around it, even if your name is Stephen Miller.
Now, Stephen Miller is the architect of many of these extreme policies. And I don't know the guy, never met him, but his public persona is a man who is driven by racism and xenophobia to keep out people who he considers to be the other. And you've actually met Stephen Miller. So tell us about that exchange and your observations about him.
I realize as I'm smiling at the memories and the oddity of meeting him, not smiling at all about his performances, going back to when I met him and he was an undergraduate at Duke University. And we probably shouldn't spend too much time on that history, just because his contemporary but just the words aren't there to describe what he's doing now in terms of all of that work I mentioned a moment ago to create ammunition for this war against Mexicans in Mexico being perpetrated for the last 3 years plus, including the campaign for the Trump presidency. But what happened is in a book prior to this book, prior to Up Against the Wall, a book called Wetback Nation, which also made a case that I consider more evolved and developed now for opening that border, the Duke University Conservative Club, Conservative Union, invited me to the university to debate Peter Brimelow, who's quite famous for having the opposite views that I have. And the two members, the two executives, the two officials of the club, bizarrely, who invited me, were Stephen Miller and a graduate student, Richard Spencer. And so I spent a couple of days with these two, who have since become infamous, of course, in immigration policy debate and other politics that where our opinions obviously are divergent. And but they were gracious. It was Duke University. It was the South, and we went out to dinner, and then the debate occurred, and I won. And so the after party was somewhat sour because they all expected to be celebrating my loss. And my wife, Sheila, had stashed a bottle of champagne up in our room. And she said, let's get out of here. This place gives me the creeps. These guys give me the creeps. So, yeah, that's enough on him, right?
Did you attempt to reach Stephen Miller to get an interview with him in the preparation for this book?
No, I really didn't think it was necessary. What I did when I conducted the research for this book was spend time what I call along the border, and that border stretches from Niagara Falls to Chiapas. The border is porous. The border is ever moving. It's not just that line that Trump claims he wishes to put a wall, this wall, the prototypes that are here in the back on the cover photograph for the book. My goal was to talk to those who were living this chaos that I mentioned, and to talk with those on the ground and politicians who were attempting to solve the problem, and see what kinds of solutions we can consider, conceptualize, engage in to begin a process to make things better. Stephen Miller and his ilk in the White House and the president are doing the opposite. And to talk to them and sit and hear that party line back was not my goal for this book. My goal for this book was seeking solutions. They're not seeking solutions. They're seeking a straw man to be able to continue to knock down to try to garner votes.
So I have had the pleasure of knowing Professor Laufer for almost 30 years now. But for people who are discovering Peter Laufer for the first time, let's give a little thumbnail background. And I'll start. You basically have a career that's been in three parts as a radio broadcaster, foreign correspondent for NBC Radio when that was a vibrant national network. You then kind of morphed into being a book author and magazine reporter or writer. And late in life, you became an academic. And as Claire mentioned in the introduction, you hold the James Wallace Chair in Journalism at the University of Oregon. And throughout these different pursuits, you've been a world traveler and you've crossed many, many borders. So you bring those experiences to the book in ways that I think are fascinating and not egocentric. You're sharing experiences, not patting yourself on the back or puffing yourself up. And I want to mention some of the books you've written that have some relationship to the topic of your current book. You wrote Iron Curtain Rising, about the end of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. Nightmare Abroad, which was a collection of stories of Americans who ran into trouble outside of our borders. Calexico, True Lives of the Borderlands. You referred to Wetback Nation. Then you also wrote See You Later, Amigo, an American border tale, and Made in Mexico. So why don't you add to that as you wish, and also try to estimate how many times you have crossed the U.S. Mexico border.
That's a tough one you just threw at me. I cannot imagine counting that, let alone other borders I crossed. So let me, if I may, take that that back from you and talk about borders, which I do so much in the book, conceptually, not just these national borders, like that border you want me to count how many times I crossed it into Mexico. I just, you've got my head swimming there trying to think back to the first time when I was turned back by the federales. I tell this story in the book because I wasn't 18 and two buddies from high school and I decided we were going to drive down to the tip of Baja, and we got just south of Ensenada. And Ensenada and Cincinnati sound similar. I almost said Cincinnati, where you're from, Peter. Just south of Ensenada. And at the time, those gringos under 18 without parental permission could not go farther than a few miles into Mexico, somewhat somewhat of a reverse to what we experience today with people coming north. So I'm from Marin County in California, and I was at a restaurant in a little town called Fairfax. I know the restaurateur, and I was at a table and he was at another table, and this speaks to borders conceptually, which is much of what the book's about. And I was overhearing him talking to somebody at his table, and he said, "Boy, am I glad to be back in Fairfax. It just feels so good to be back across the line here in Fairfax." And I thought, oh, I wonder where he went. And so I asked him, where were you? And he said, San Rafael. And of course, Peter is laughing, and some of you watching may laugh, because San Rafael is 3 miles east. It's the county seat. But it really is indicative of how we create borders, and not always for bad reasons. There's nothing wrong with establishing our perimeters conceptually or actually. The problem is when we do something, in my opinion, that is devious, when we do something that is hurtful, when we do something that is counterintuitive, when we do something that benefits us at the expense of others, when we do something that is illegal. And all of those things in that litany are what the United States government is doing now, and unfortunately has done to a great extent historically, just not with the crudeness, the vile behavior, and the ghastly numbers of victims. Well, maybe that happened during Operation Wetback during the Hoover administration with the ghastly number of victims. But that's when it's a problem. It's a problem when there are victims. It's not a problem when you want to shut the bathroom door and push the button on it.
Peter, you make a reference in the book to the Maginot Line. And when I was 12, my dad took me and my brothers and mom to Europe. We camped out of a Volkswagen bus. And my dad had been a veteran of World War II, and he was a history student of both wars. And he took us to the Maginot Line. And for people who don't know much about it, it was built after World War I to prevent a second German invasion of France. And they miscalculated because they built these gunnery emplacements, and the guns did not swivel 360 degrees. And when the Luftwaffe overflew the Maginot Line, it was instantly useless. And to me, that's a vivid representation of how the medieval barriers of these kinds of walls, including Trump's border wall, are really ridiculous, that you cannot stop the passage of humans, whether they fly over it, tunnel under it, or get a ladder that's 2 feet taller than whatever barrier you build. And I don't know what your favorite visualization is of the idiocy of walls, but I'm asking you for it now.
Yeah, well, the Maginot Line is certainly one of them. In addition to the Luftwaffe story, there was an end to the line, and some of Hitler's troops just went to the end of the Maginot Line and came around and went into France. So I lived in Berlin. I lived in Berlin for a year before the wall came down, a year after the wall came down. And idiocy maybe is not the word I would use, because again, that was a place of tragedy. But when one goes back to Berlin now, or goes to Berlin now, if you've not been there, as I recount in the book, it's a tourist attraction. Of course, it's a historical reality, and there are some small sections of the wall still in place in order to study, look at, buy a t-shirt, and get an ice cream cone. And that reality, that something as severe, and as Erich Honecker, who ran East Germany right before the wall came down, said, this will be here for 100 years, and it was there for maybe 100 days after that. It's indicative of, as you said, and as the book documents, human migration, especially when it is motivated by economic need, by survival, by family reunification, is not stoppable. You can make it miserable, and you can certainly stop some individuals. But is that the kind of policy we want to have? I say no. I say no in the book, particularly, and for a start, with Mexico, because there are some raw realities with numbers. And I like to look for the places, as I said earlier, where those of us who come from different political points of view can agree about a problem and then maybe begin to agree about a solution. Everybody in the world can't, not that they would necessarily want to, can't come here. But Mexico is a special case. And what we are doing, and what we have done historically, going back at least to when we started a war and took half the country, it is egregious, and we do it for our own profit. And then some of us hide behind saying, hey, stay out of here, this is ours. That's wrong, and it doesn't work.
So, Peter, I believe fundamentally that every nation has a right to control its borders. But I also believe that that control has to be rational. And I believe that for decades now, we have been in an irrational mindset about controlling our border, particularly the southern border. And I'd like you to take a couple of minutes here to articulate your arguments for revising the regulations related to Mexican entry into the United States. And you're not, in my view, talking about just a wide open border where anybody can cross in either direction at any time, but you're talking about reducing the level of regulation to a rational model.
So here's the thing, Peter. Basically, I can't argue, and I do in the book, that any Mexican who wants to come north of the border will get here. And so do we want what we have now, which is millions of people in the country? We don't know. That might not be a bad thing. It's certainly, my point of view is the opposite of the president's. I think the vast majority of the people who are here from Mexico are just like anybody else who's here, basically good people. So do we want people coming in across the border without knowing who they are? Because as you just said, a country, I think most of us agree, wants to regulate its borders, just like I've got the front door of the house there locked because I don't want somebody coming in right now. We're talking. So if you look at the Canadian border as a model, pretty much any Canadian who wants to can come down here. They don't just come across from Manitoba into North Dakota via cornfields. They go through border control points. And we know who they are, and we take a look at their passport or other papers, and we run them through some sort of check and make sure they're not wanted. And in they come, and it's 6 months, if I'm remembering correctly, to do whatever they want to do in the 50 states. It's nothing like that for Mexicans. Nothing like that for Mexicans. And any Mexican who wants to can't just come north the way any Canadian can come south. So let's make it the same. Let's make it the same. And let's have Mexicans who want to come north, no matter what they want to come north for. Do they want to come here to study? Do they want to come and see relatives? Do they want to come and work? Do they want to come and go to Disneyland? Whatever they want to do, come on up. And a lot of where they would come up, it used to be their country anyway. Come on up and just go through a border crossing. And the same thing happens with Canadians. Now, we've got other problems farther south in Central America. So do the Central Americans. We can deal with that later. My issue is let's see if we can come up with a model for Mexico and Mexicans. Now, there's another factor here. For the most part, Canadians aren't being seduced down here to go to work. So while we are supposedly trying to prevent Mexicans from coming up here, we are actively seducing them to come up to do work. And like it or not, the reality of the cliche is true. Work that those who are here don't want to do. We're seducing them to come up here, and we're making it as hard as possible to come up here through any legal mechanism. And so they come up and they are here as de facto outlaws because we want them here. None of that makes any sense unless you want to demonize somebody and unless you want to keep them oppressed and suppressed, and unless you don't like them because of where they're from, because they're not Norwegians.
So, Peter, at the base of this are economic fears of people who I think inaccurately believe that a Mexican wants to take my job or his job. And we've seen that Trump has successfully driven a racist message to create fear of the caravans of people who, for their own safety, were traveling together as they migrated from Central America through Mexico to approach the U.S. border. And agree or disagree, I believe that politically, this issue is much more potent and useful to primarily the Republicans, but some Democrats as well, if left unresolved. Because if we did, for example, adopt the bill that the Senate passed in, I believe it was 2013, I opposed it because it had $39 billion for border barriers. They weren't called a wall, but that was the compromise bill that came out of the Senate. But the House, which was then controlled by Republicans under John Boehner, would not even take up parts of the Senate bill, including the money for barriers. And we've seen it exploited successfully to divide Americans, to demonize non-Americans, and we are no closer to any comprehensive resolution of these complex issues than we were, pick a point, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, even 20 years ago.
Oh, and you can even go back further. You can go back historically, again, to the Hoover administration. You can go back to the turn of the century. My book starts with the story of my father coming through Ellis Island when those immigrants from Middle Europe were, one could say, the Mexicans of the time, and they were feared as anarchists, was the label that was slapped on everybody that wasn't from Norway. And I interrupted you because you probably had a question there at the end.
No, I just want you to comment on that because I don't see any real political desire to resolve these issues.
No, absolutely not. And historically, there hasn't been a successful compromise, political desire to find compromise. There have been attempts to come up with something on one side or another. And maybe in our recent history, the closest was when George W. Bush, for all his frailties and criminal activities, from my point of view, was working with Vicente Fox, who, by the way, wrote the foreword to the book, and when Fox was president in Mexico, and the two of them Fox had a ranch. Bush spoke Spanish and was from Texas. There were commonalities. Bush understood as a Texan, or at least he articulated that he understood the appropriateness of the commingling that exists historically and in our contemporary times, in our times, and certainly it was on the agenda for Fox to fix this. And 9/11 interfered with those ongoing talks. So that might be a point where there was the potential for some coming together satisfactorily to achieve some sort of legislative solution. There was the 1986 law, the immigration law, which provided for the legalization of millions of people who were here, but that was problematic because there were ways to deceive the process, and it also opened up the country to immigration that feared that after the fact they would not be able to get into the country. It also suggested to those who might want to come here that everything would get worked out for them also. So these kinds of stopgap efforts, like the 1986 law, are not a solution. Perhaps what Fox and Bush too were doing could have resolved some of this, but this is, as you suggest, a problem, and the book goes through it chapter and verse. That includes President Obama, who took on, unfortunately, the negative nickname of deporter-in-chief. And I've mentioned Herbert Hoover a couple of times, and Operation Wetback, which resulted in a lot of American citizens being identified along the lines of the movie Born in East LA and getting dumped into Mexico, and they knew nothing about Mexico because they were Americans, to use the term American. And by the way, that's something else I address in the book. We're all Americans, from Barrow, Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, but we have come to, all of us in Mexico and here, to refer to United States citizens as Americans, and the United States of Mexico citizens as Mexicans. Interestingly enough, Vicente Fox, and among others, calls those of us who are citizens of this country U.S. Americans.
Interesting. You mentioned the 86 reform, and I want to underscore that was signed by Ronald Reagan. It was authored by a California congressman who later was our attorney general, an arch conservative named Dan Lundgren. And despite that, Rush Limbaugh turned that whole effort into a single word: amnesty. And Republicans have used that to poison any attempt to rationalize border control between the U.S. and Mexico. That if there's any step that regularizes the presence of undocumented people in the United States through giving them residential status or some other status equivalent to a green card, that is amnesty, and amnesty is completely anathema.
Yeah, well, those of us who are Californians or New Mexicans or Arizonans or Nevadans or Coloradans or portions of Wyoming should be seeking amnesty from Mexico City, since we took all of that land from Mexico in a war of aggression, despite the fact that President Clinton, again, to show how this transcends the two parties, President Clinton made a speech one Memorial Day at Arlington National Cemetery about how the United States has never fought a war of aggression to achieve territorial gain. Well, President Polk, both in his official speeches, his talks with his cabinet, and his diaries, makes it very clear that is exactly what the war with Mexico was, and it had its own Gulf of Tonkin realities to stage a skirmish between Mexican troops and American troops in order to rationalize going to war and seizing all this land.
In just a few minutes, we're going to open this up for questions from our viewers. Peter, I want to quote from a passage in the book, partly to highlight what I touted earlier, your descriptive powers, but also to bring in one of the many people whom you interviewed and who are quoted in the book. And this is former Congressman Sylvester Reyes, who was a Border Patrol officer before he was elected from a district in Texas. And you quote him, "I was born, raised, worked on the border all my life." And here is the description that I want people to relate to. There was a replica of the Statue of Liberty in Congressman Reyes' crowded Capitol Hill office, along with military mementos of his workload on the Armed Services Committee. His grandparents emigrated from Mexico. He's a product of the American dream, a fact he considered part of his routine while working his Border Patrol beat, chasing Mexicans. Quote, "You recognize that there, but for fate, you might be going. You have a full understanding of the implications of what you're doing." Reyes is a stout man, gray showing in his neatly combed and cleanly parted hair. His military posture reflects his years of wearing a badge. And I'll pause there. But you go on to tell us that Reyes was a principal author of the Southwest Border Program that in many ways cruelly shifted the focal point for northbound migrants from the established border stations like Nogales or San Isidro near San Diego, and pushed them out more into the rugged frontiers, which led them to be facing predators, both human and animal, and of course the hostile conditions of the desert, particularly during certain seasons. And I want to bring up Reyes because he was a Democrat. And yet he was responsible for some counterproductive reforms to our immigration policies.
Yeah, I like to think, well, first of all, it's also interesting that at least at the time I talked with him, he was the only active Border Patrolman who had been elected to Congress, which makes for an interesting dynamic and certainly plenty of credibility regarding the issue. I like to think that he did not, I was about to say think it through, that's maybe not fair, that he could not imagine what the results of this policy to harden the border, create walls way before Trump, to harden the border at urban crossing points in order to make it so the least patrolled and border areas with the fewest barriers would be in the wilds of the Southwest deserts. So I would like to think that he figured people would not try to brave the elements and the bandits and all of the other problems that exist crossing the border anyway, and especially in these remote places. That's not what happened. And thousands have died going across the border. Thousands have been preyed on by criminals. And that policy of consciously pushing people to the wilds has been one of the most tragic, heartbreaking realities of these failed attempts to do what's impossible and what nobody really wants, which is to prevent Mexicans from coming into the United States.
So, Peter Laufer, at this point, I do want to open up our chat window here to see if we have questions or comments from the people who are currently viewing. And we welcome you to post your comment or question, and I'll get to as many as I can. While I'm waiting for those to come in, I want to confess that I always learn many things from your books, some major and some minor. And as a recovering rock and roll DJ, I thought Jefferson Airplane invented the phrase "up against the wall."
Careful.
I said
up against the wall. What?
I said MF.
Oh, okay. Just checking, because it is a fascinating chant, "up against the wall," and that's a good way to handle it, MF. And yes, it's on their album. You help me here because I've never been a disc jockey. Anthem, is that?
No, it's on Volunteers.
Oh, right, Volunteers, of course. And of course, he says, not knowing one whit about the Jefferson Airplane body of work in terms of album name. But no, that came later. And one of the things I thought would be appropriate, given the title of the book and given the issues, walls, again, the book is about, it focuses on our wall, our border with Mexico, but it's about walls across time. It's about walls across cultures and what works and what doesn't, and how, as we discussed, movements of people, for those who are moving for economic reasons, for family reunification reasons, the walls don't stop them. They stop them for a while maybe, but they don't stop them, and the walls become tourist attractions. The phrase "up against the wall" and "up against the wall" MF dates, as best I can figure, looking back at it as an academic, to the mid-60s. It was used by Leroy Jones around the time of the Newark riots or rebellions, depending on the terminology you want to use. And he wrote a poem that had a line that said something to the effect, I don't have it in front of me, that if there's something that you need, just go to a store and use the magic word, take out your pistol. I believe that's in the poem. Don't hold me to that, but you can find it easily. And the magic word is "up against the wall," MF. However, it does seem that it's something that predated his use, because it apparently, and this is where, and if you're out there and you can help me with this research, this piece of research, let me know. It apparently was something that was commonly used by the Newark Police Department when they were in the Black ghetto and arresting Black people. And they would say during the process routinely, "up against the," well, that's too gentle, "up against the wall," MF. And then it was adopted during the Columbia University student protests and takeover, and it became a chant there. There was a group of whatever they would call themselves, who were downtown in New York City, engaged in street activities around the time of the Vietnam War, and they called themselves "Up Against the Wall," MF. And that was just prior to the Jefferson Airplane song. And then, as you well recall, old man, it was something that was used all throughout the 60s and 70s as a rallying cry. And so it seemed appropriate, given the subject matter of the book, to delve into the history of the slogan.
And Peter, as you thought about it and decided to use it as a title for your book, how do you translate it? What is that connection in the mind of the author?
Well, in the mind of the author, it's multiple. It's up against the wall in terms of being thrown against it. It's up against the wall because we are up against the wall dealing with this problem on our Mexican border, and Mexicans are up against that same wall on the other side of the border. And it is up against the wall in the new borders. Since the Berlin Wall came down, as I document in the book, there are so many more borders, national border walls, and maybe one of the most egregious, both conceptually and philosophically, is the one on the Hungarian-Serbian border. Hungary, which suffered so greatly along with other Eastern European countries because of the Iron Curtain, has thrown this Iron Curtain up to try to keep refugees out, primarily coming from Afghanistan and Syria. So the wall, up against the wall, it works in multiple ways. And I have a section in the book where I go through those, what I believe is the importance of thinking through that phrase without the MF, up against the wall.
Peter, a viewer named David is asking, what are the best arguments one might use to persuade someone who supports Trump that an open border would serve conservatives?
Well, I think the first thing to do is make sure that phraseology is handled carefully. And just as you pointed out, the perverse use of amnesty by, I can't think of an adequately derogatory term for Rush Limbaugh, of the Rush Limbaughs of the world. So does open borders. It resonates as a term that's problematic. And we're not talking about an open border, at least I'm not. I'm talking about a border that is controlled, but allows anybody who has a reason to come up here and doesn't have a record that would make it so we wouldn't want them up here to come here. So to answer specifically the question, I like to start it the same way I started this conversation with Bill O'Reilly on his television show before he was fired because of his perverse activities with his coworkers. And that is, we can, and you and I talked about this at the beginning of our Village Books conversation here, we can all agree, I believe, all of us, no matter our political points of view, no matter what we think ought to be done at the border, we can all agree that the border's out of control, it's chaotic, it's no good for anybody. So that's my starting point with those who don't want a border that makes it easy for Mexicans to come here. And then I take it step by step and say, and I go through this in the book, if we agree that it's chaotic, it's out of control, and it's not good for anybody, then what can we do about that? Well, if we take it to that next step, that most of the people who come up here from Mexico are coming up here because we want them here. And remember, we have a declining population. If we don't enjoy immigration, we're not going to have enough people up here. And so if we have these points here, it's out of control, we want the people that want to come up here, then the next step is really easy. Come on up here, come through these border crossing points where you flash your passport and it goes through the computer and we find out you're not a drug dealer wanted, you're not a murderer wanted, you're not a wife abuser wanted, you're somebody who wants to visit their grandmother in the Bronx. Come on up. You're somebody who wants to go to Disneyland with your 3 kids. Come on up. You're somebody who has a job offer in Washington State picking pears so that they don't rot on the ground as they did a few years ago when the border was suddenly successfully stopped briefly. Come on up. That I think is something that if you handle it with a little more diplomacy and finesse than I just did, and maybe take it slower and have a beer or a Coke in between, that's something that you can use with somebody who disagrees with you to at least begin the conversation. And then listen hard. And what do they have to say? What might their ideas be besides a monstrosity like that wall that's on the cover of the book?
Peter, NAFTA and the renegotiated U.S. Mexico Canada trade deal, those are attempts to reduce the power of the economic magnet for people to cross our borders. What's your opinion of those treaties?
Those treaties are problematic because they victimize often those in Mexico who are trying to stay in Mexico and make life work for them. It's a complicated issue. So is it better for somebody in Mexico, say down in Chiapas, almost in Guatemala, to come up to a border town and leave their families behind, live in substandard conditions often, and work for more money than they would make in Chiapas, substantially more, but still a fraction of what they would make if they were right across the border on the United States side? That doesn't seem right. So what we've got with these treaties, no matter what the words say, what we've got looking at the history of NAFTA, and we have to give a little time to its cousin, but it's pretty much the same thing, to make sure that there aren't positive changes. But what we've got is basically the free movement of goods and the free movement of capital, but we don't have the free movement of people. So it doesn't work if it's not fair, and it doesn't work if it doesn't include labor, and the jobs aren't going to go away because the people are already here, but the people are here in jeopardy. The people are here and they cannot exert their rights. all of this is documented point by point in the book. And what I hope, and it was very gracious of you to say, Peter, that the prose is accommodatable, but we need to address this, or we're going to continue to have a problem between the two countries unnecessarily. And we are going to continue to have fodder for the Trumps of the world to use against people. That's not to say that there aren't problems in Mexico. Mexico should be a much more vibrant economy. Mexico is rife with crimes that result in impunity for the criminals. These things need to be addressed by Mexico and by Mexicans. But the solution for us, just selfishly, is not to have this border chaos.
Let me combine two questions from viewers. In a new administration, what would you like to see as a first step for change? And if Biden wins, do you have any projections as to changes that he would make?
Yeah, well, his attention seems to be elsewhere now, which is understandable because Trump's attention is elsewhere. Trump's wall is a failure. There are about 3 miles of new barriers. The rest of this stuff that's shown off is rebuilt old wall. Wall is not new to Trump. So the role of an incoming administration that's not a Trump administration, I would hope would be initially to turn down the volume and then return, for those who are really suffering, to the way things were handled for immigrants that come across the border without documentation and are caught, and for those who are coming to the border and seeking amnesty, asylum, excuse me, I'm using Rush Limbaugh's term again, seeking asylum, to return to the status quo ante that existed during the Obama years, and then we can begin to move to a longer term solution. But for now, we have to stop this predatory behavior by the Trump administration that is victimizing those who are most needy and most suffering. It's not fair. It is putting them up against the wall. And the ones who should be up against the wall are Trump and Stephen Miller and their buddies.
Peter, as we wrap up, I want to note that you scored quite a coup to get former Mexican President Vicente Fox to write a foreword to your book. And for people who are struggling, Vicente Fox, well, he's the one who went public and viral with a video back in 2016, directed at candidate Trump, that Mexico will not pay for your effing wall.
And Mexico didn't.
And no, they haven't. So tell us about your meeting with the former president and set the scene, because he lives behind a wall.
He does indeed live behind a wall, and he's very happy that he does. I was able to contact him through some mutual associates and was invited down to Guanajuato, where his hacienda is. And he is such an ideal forward writer, such a gracious gentleman, but such an ideal forward writer for a book that deals with migration and walls, because yes, he's in the hacienda behind walls, his grandfather's hacienda, and his grandfather, as he tells the tale to me, over a beer in the hacienda bar, because the hacienda now is a boutique hotel that is used to raise money to maintain the Fox Presidential Library. It's the first library, presidential library of a Mexican president, along the lines of the presidential libraries that we have up here north of the border. And as he tells the tale, his grandfather needed the wall around the hacienda to protect the hacienda from Pancho Villa during the Mexican Revolution. What, begs the question, was his grandfather doing down in Guanajuato? Well, in terms of immigration and border crossing, his grandfather, as are you, Peter, was from Ohio. And his grandfather suffered from some respiratory condition. I believe it was asthma. And his doctor said, you need to get out of this miserable climate that you know well, Peter, in Ohio, and get to some place where it's hot and dry. So he got on the train, and he got off the train, apparently by chance, as President Fox tells the story, in Guanajuato. and got a job in a bicycle shop. And it's the American dream in Mexico. He worked his way up. He bought the bicycle shop. He then was able to buy the hacienda. And so the president of Mexico, who defeated the PRI, the party that had been in power, locking down Mexican politics for over 70 years, who was, in fact, the president of Coca-Cola Mexico, and then, if I'm remembering his history correctly, Coca-Cola Latin America, a businessman who was elected president. The president of Mexico is the grandson of an immigrant from Ohio. We are all in this mixmaster together in the world, but especially Mexico and the United States, we are intertwined. And for us to arrogantly suggest that there's something better up here, especially as you, Peter, I know, and so many go down to Mexico to play, a lot of Americans go down to Mexico to retire. This is something to solve. And I hope with this book, Up Against the Wall, the case for opening the Mexican-American border, I begin the discussion. I set out a blueprint. It might not be your blueprint. It might not be the blueprint that works as I set it out, but I hope it at least begins the conversation.
Well, Peter, thank you so much. I think we might have maybe lost connection with the other Peter. Oh, there he is. Yay!
Somebody tried to call on my cell phone and interrupted the feed here.
Well,
let me just conclude by saying that I only got to about a third of my questions for Peter Laufer, drawn from the new book, Up Against the Wall. And I encourage people to read it. I think you'll find it fascinating and provocative. I also want you to note that he doesn't just present people in the book who agree with him, like cable news would, and the reaction of President Fox is notable among many people who are in the U.S. without papers, who don't particularly agree with some of the premises of the open border with Mexico that you described. So I think it will provoke a lot of thought and some lively conversation if you share it with people who are interested in learning more about this topic. So I want to thank you, our viewers, for joining us today for this online conversation, and I'll hand it back to Claire.
And on behalf of Village Books, I want to say thank you to both of you, both of the Peters, Peter Laufer and Peter B. Collins, for being with me this evening. And again, the book is Up Against the Wall, and we have copies for sale. If you click on the link below this video, it'll take you directly to our website where we have the book for sale. Gentlemen, any parting words? My last word would be thank you and vote. Anyone else?
Muchísimas gracias, right?
That'll work. Are we clear?
I am just about to end the broadcast. I thought, Mr. Laufer, you would like to maybe say one last thing, like goodbye. Okay, I'm signing out.